Hello and welcome to the Olive Tree Media webinar series. My name is Ainsley Freeman and I'm one of the team at Olive Tree Media, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today. We have this webinar hosted by Karl Faase, and he will be joined by Dr. David Hastie. And they're going to cover topics surrounding faith, education, and some of the issues around Australian schooling. It's great to have you here, and we welcome you from every lunchroom, every home, every church, and every school right across Australia. And we just want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that you are all joining us from. And we recognize our almighty creator God and how generations have stewarded the land. And we just want to welcome you. And we would love for you to let us know where you're joining us from. So don't be shy, say hi in the chat. And as we get towards the end of the webinar, there will be an opportunity for a Q&A. So if you have a question for David and for Karl, just put a Q at the start of your question and we'll gather them up as the webinar goes along and we'll address them at the end. And the last thing I wanted to let you know about is I'd love for you to save the date of our next webinar. It's actually going to be on the evening of the 6th of September. And we're going to be joined by Justin Briley, who is a UK author and former broadcaster, and he used to host a UK radio show called Unbelievable, and he has been curating conversations between Christians and non-Christians for about a decade. And so he's about to launch his new book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. So it's going to be a great conversation. So just save the date, 6th of September, but that one will be in the evening. But I'd love to welcome Karl Faase now, and we'll get started with today's webinar.
Thank you, Ainsley, and welcome everybody. Thanks for those people who've let us know that you're here in the chat. We've got people here from Sutherland, which is where we are, to the Sunshine Coast, Dubbo, Bathurst, Kew in Melbourne, and John has just come in from Hawthorne, so thank you. It's great to have you with us. Let people know you're here. Let's continue to connect and chat. It's a really significant topic we're looking at today, writing Jesus back into our history and our future, and later on we can give you the opportunity to ask some questions. We also have the privilege of welcoming Dr. David Hastie, is Associate Professor at Alphacrucis University College, also has the fabulous title as the Deputy Vice President of Development at Alphacrucis College. He's an education commentator, regularly published in newspapers, etc. But he also has quite a deep experience in the school sector. So David, welcome. What's your background as a teacher?
Yeah, well, thanks, Karl. It's great to be here. I really love what Olive Tree Media has been doing. I've really enjoyed your high production videos over the last few years. Look, I started as a regular school teacher in Western Sydney and worked in the bush. Was 18 years in schools until across 4 different school sector types, until I moved into school head offices and then moved into the university scene. Yeah. So it's been a wonderful journey, but my roots lie in that kind of real sort of shoe leather of classrooms.
Do you miss it? Do you miss the classroom?
Oh, absolutely. If you're a teacher and you're a born teacher and you love teaching, there's an instant gratification in teaching. You can see an instant reward and the bucket fills up. You know, you lose track of time. I don't miss swimming carnivals. I don't miss bus duty. I don't miss year 7 cohorts of year 7 squealing in stairwells. But and I don't miss the paperwork. But the actual theatre of the classroom and that live wire, that live moment of learning is one of the things that keeps you going as a teacher.
Wonderful. Hey, you said you worked in 4 different systems, and to start off, we want to get a bit of a feel for the Australian kind of education system at the moment. So, what percentage of kids are in non-government schools, and which are they from?
Look, it's a bit of a surprising figure, particularly for those of us who went through state education, because it was the norm when I was a youngster. We've actually got 36.6% of all Australian school enrolments are in non-government schools.
Right.
And when we elevate that to the secondary school level, it's actually 40%. Over 40% of Australian secondary school enrolments are in non-government schools.
Wow.
90% of these are affiliated to Christianity.
Yeah.
And so that's an unusual figure for most. It comes as a bit of a surprise. And so if you actually track that it comes in at about 33.3% in total across all ages are enrolled in non-government Christian affiliated schools. And in terms of international standards, that's really quite unusual. We're actually the third highest proportion of non-government schools in the Western world, 11th highest in the OECD.
Yeah.
And then it takes us to the 7th highest access to school choice in the OECD, but actually the highest in a comparable Western nation. So when parents get to choose a school, they have the highest access of choice.
That's a remarkable stat that would really surprise people. Can you tell us what's the trajectory on that? Is that growing? Is it dropping? Is it what is the trajectory?
Yeah, well, records began around in the mid-1960s with the Australian Bureau of Stats. Since the 1980s, there's been an unstopped growth in independent school enrolments. They've gone up without any receding. There was a slight receding in across a period of 3 years from around about 2015 to 2018 in Catholic primary schools, but COVID completely reversed all of that. There was a 0.6 migration out of government schools in 1 year in 21 to 22, and we still haven't tracked the migration out of government schools in the year just gone. So there'll be a lag effect from COVID because there was a significant social effect where a lot of parents transferred their enrolment of their children from state schools into non-government schools during the COVID pandemic.
Let me just say, David, for those of you listening, we apparently had no sound for a short time. I think it's back on. Michelle, I hope you can get your sound back on and you'll join us and you can catch up on the marvellous things that David has just said if you missed them. David, in this setting, you know, as you said, the Australian scene is fairly unique internationally of countries that are like ours. Is that just our culture or is that history? I mean, what's the history that created such a large non-government school sector and a large Christian sector?
I think it has its origins probably in our culture, but it's not our culture today. It's actually due to historical structures. So if you just get the picture right, Australia was settled as a large jail, outdoors jail, and most of the people there, including several of my ancestors, were pretty much criminals, and education wasn't a priority. Large amounts of the Australian population, right up until the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, were completely illiterate, not going to school at all. And so the government basically paid very little attention to any form of centralised schooling. The churches all stepped in, set up schools here and there. All of the churches were arguing with each other, often violently, and so they all set up their own schools on every, if you've ever been to small country towns that have some age in them, you'll see different schools set up next to the different churches. And so it was incredibly inefficient. So you had an Anglican church, Anglican school, a Baptist school, a Catholic school, sometimes a Presbyterian school, and they're all doing the same thing in the same little town. Huge duplication of resources. No one was able to staff it properly. It was in basically slab huts with dirt floors. Students had to pay to go. And so everyone realised this was a disaster. To become a more, well, at that time it was states, actually, colonies and states. There was no notion of a unified country. Each of the states decided they needed to have a government system. And what happened was that the churches, the Protestant churches, went into an agreement with the state governments at the time, the state parliaments, to hand their elementary schools, because we're not talking about high schools, there was hardly any high schools, hand their elementary schools over to the state in exchange for 1 hour of clerical visiting per week, but also for what was you could roughly describe as a general Protestant presence throughout the curriculum. And so in the 1880s, the Public Instruction Acts were set up in all of the states except for Western Australia was a decade later. And they aimed to bring everyone together more or less for economic reasons so that the states could build viable economies and standardise education. Very centralised.
So you've got the idea that with the Protestant churches, they start education, the government takes it over, but these churches and these schools have a relationship and access to the schools for religious education. What's happening with the Catholics? And when did that change?
Prior to the 1880s, it was exactly the situation across all of the denominations. They were all setting up their own schools. The Catholics in the 1880s basically decided that there was too much of a gap between what the Public Instruction Acts were trying to do, that it was really a Protestant gentleman's agreement. And there was some argument, and valid argument, I think, to say that it really was a way of squeezing the Catholic Church out of the social contract. And so at that time, they decided to set up their diocesan education systems, which more or less replicated the state's school systems, but they went completely outside of any government funding for about a century.
Wow.
And so it was a very bold move by the Catholic Church, but you have to consider it in the times where you had the Irish and Highland Scots Catholic minority, who a lot of them were coming from convict stock, but they were seen by the Anglican and Protestant ascendancy as a threat to national security. And there was this massive sectarian warfare going on for a century in Australia. It was terrible, bitter hatred, violence, arguments going on between these sects. And so the Catholics decided to set up this alternative education system, and that sectarianism ran deep within Australia up until my living memory in small country towns.
And when did that change? Because that changed again in Gough Whitlam seeking election, didn't it?
There was a drip feed of funding about science labs from the Menzies government into non-government schools, and that was about STEM training in the country. But then Whitlam, following on from what's called the Carmel Report, extended federal funding to Catholic schools or non-government schools. Everyone assumed it was just Catholic schools. To bring the Catholic vote back into the Labor Party after the big split over the Communist Party in the 1950s, which was successful. Whitlam came back in, but what Whitlam hadn't really understood was he'd set up a mechanism for all the other religious organisations who wanted to set up a non-government school, or any organisation who wanted to set up a non-government school, could now access federal funding, bypass the states, which were only funding the state schools. And that really was a legislative mechanism that led to the growth of non-government schools in the late 1970s, particularly between 78 and 82, a huge proliferation of these low-fee Christian schools all started up all over the place, in Baptist church halls, in people's lounge rooms, in community halls. And those schools have now grown into this massive number that we referred to earlier. That's really the historical trajectory. But there's a couple of other choice factors going around. Australia has really the average income of Australia has doubled in 20 years. The GDP is one of the highest in the world, if not the highest, depending on which measures you use. And so capitalism has really moved into the centre of the experience of middle-class Australia. And what they are actually doing is they're starting to exercise purchase options. And so there's an economic slipstream happening here as well. It's not just about religious schooling; it's about broader social conditions.
Can we come back to that? Going back to the late 19th century, like the 1880s and 90s that we talked about. When we chatted, it sounded like it was all very smooth and everybody was happy, but that wasn't necessarily the case, was it? I mean, there was pushback about religious education in schools and religion having involvement, and there were places where the church had to push for the opportunity. Yeah,
look, it's actually far less than you would have anticipated. It's actually far less than's being sort of recently publicised, and we need to understand that it was very rare to be an atheist in the late 19th century. Anywhere, it's actually quite rare now, if you actually take a global perspective. And historically, extremely unique. I mean, I don't know whether it's a passing fad. I really don't. Time will tell. But there were a few radicals on the outside of the argument who were sort of coming from, I suppose, what you might call the secular humanist tradition coming through the French tradition, which had its various manifestations in the American tradition as well. But that was obviously a big mixture of religion and secularism in their foundation. There was, in Victoria, there was a 6-year period where they tried to keep religion out of schools altogether from 1881. But that was monumentally unsuccessful. And so they brought it all back in after just under 6 years of trying that little experiment. Yeah. In all the other states, there really was not a great deal of pushback. People were never going to win the argument about keeping religion out of schools because religion was everywhere in society. It just didn't make any sense. And when they called it free, compulsory and secular, there was absolutely no idea that that would mean big secular. You know, that would mean the elimination of religion from the public square. That would have been seen as absurd at the time.
But here we are, like 100 to 140 years later, and there is a push that it ought to be a kind of religious-free zone, and that education should be a religious-free zone. So we want to chat. I want to chat to you about a couple of areas which we'll get to over the next little while. Partly about religion in state schools, and then Christian education and Christian schools. But religion in state schools, there is a push that says that, you know, we're a secular society in general. We're no longer a Christian society, and that being the case, religion shouldn't be in a school system in any way, shape or form. What's the argument that says that actually it should, and it has an important place?
It's a really important question. And I think we need to take a step back and understand that a mandated school system is an artifact of something else. It's an artifact of what a society sees itself to be, a social identity. As goes the school, there goes the society, and vice versa. It has been said that school education is simply a conversation between two generations about the purpose of life. And so the way that you design your school system is you're either projecting into what society should be like, or you're reflecting what society is. And most school systems in Western democracies are doing both. They're a reflection and an ambition, I suppose. So we need to ask ourselves the question, are we a big secular society, or are we a plural society? And I think I probably want to refer to what I would describe as the controversy of difference, because religion presents a problem for a free society in that religions are different. They're fundamentally different. Anyone who says that Islam is the same as Christianity, is the same as Judaism, same as Hindu, all believe in the same God eventually, and we're all on the same page, just simply hasn't experienced enough and hasn't read enough, right? Yeah. The entire metaphysical frameworks of these beliefs are different. And so it represents a risk to social harmony that in the past has led to extreme violence, right? And throughout the history of the world. And so there's a couple of ways that you can manage this in the social contract. One is you could do what they've done in America and in France and seek to deal with the risk of the controversy of difference by eliminating the risk from the public sphere, from public schooling. Or you can do what's done more in the Westminster tradition, in the British tradition, which Australia was kind of more founded on constitutionally, and that is to mitigate the risk of the controversy of difference by giving the different voices expression, but in a limited and a civilized way. So we don't say to families and children, you cannot bring your religion through the school gates. We say you can bring it, right? And it can be confessional, and it can be expressed, but it needs to be expressed in these particular ways so that everyone is safe and social harmony is possible. The idea that you would drive it out with a big secular management through elimination of risk is, from my point of view, and I think from a lot of people's points of view, is not really the way that Australian plural society works. We're not a big secular society. We are a plural society. A theistic or a transcendent belief about the nature of the world is still the demographic norm. Most people believe there is some sort of a God or a spiritual thing that's spiritual but not religious. And so to say that Australia is a secular society, well, I mean, maybe soft secular, I don't know. Why have we got 40% of secondary school enrollments in Christian schools if we're a secular society? It doesn't look very secular to me.
I mean, I want to come back to that about those enrollments, but Dave, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's a bit like you come to that, we, all of us, every person in Australia comes to that question with their own aspirational values, which is what you said before about the conversation between the generations. You know, if you believe that Australia should only be a secular society, then religion is a blight on the community, then you want to drive it out. If you see it as a positive influence, then you want it to have space in the school system. The question, one of my questions is, how do you mitigate the risks? But I remember there was a school in Sydney where there was one particular religious group who seemed to be generating some fairly unhelpful values among the young people in those groups. And there was this kind of major push back on that. And you could see, well, that seems dangerous. So where has it become dangerous, and how do you mitigate those risks?
Well, danger is everywhere in schools, whether it's religion or something else. Whether it's the teaching of this or the teaching of that, or that text or this problem. And when it becomes a problem is when my argument is that all good school education is based on consensus. It's not based on some hard ideological drive that's coming from a particular section. And this is actually what happens. What's happening right now in schools all around the country, people are being taught maths, they're being taught science, they're being taught Shakespeare right now. And no one's arguing about it because there's a tacit consensus between four key stakeholders. One is the educating institution, and in this context, in our country, that means a governing institution as well, because it's related to the state. The second is parents. The third is students. And the fourth is society at large. Now, there's a tacit consent between those four institutions to say, we agree that teaching this is right. Okay. Now, when two or more of those stakeholders are not consulted, or who are left out of the consent process, then it flares up. It becomes a media issue. People start talking about terrible books that are being taught, or maybe some bizarre sort of progressive sexuality agendas being pushed in Victoria or whatever. And so for example, with the Safe Schools Coalition materials in a few years ago, the problem was that people just weren't consulted, right? Parents weren't consulted. Society at large wasn't on the same page. And so in terms of managing religious problems or risks or other risks, you need to have this kind of consent process between those four key players. Religion needs to be, in schools, needs to be very central. It needs to be reasonably non-controversial. There's crazy edges to everything, religion included. Those crazy edges need to be mitigated. They need to be mitigated by giving everyone an expression, a place where they can freely express, but with boundaries and with limits. And that's because we're in a plural society trying to get along together. I'm not a Muslim. I don't believe in the tenets of Islam, but I will fight to the death to defend a Muslim's right to attend a mosque and to believe what they believe in my society. I will fight for the right for Islamic schooling to exist and to be staffed by Muslims, because as go they, so go I. And that's the nature of a plural society.
And a plural society means that what you're saying is that within a state education system, a public, state-controlled education system, that religion should have a space, but not be forced on everybody, and risks of extremism mitigate against.
Well, one of the interesting things is that recent research indicates that extremism, as in religious extremism, particularly amongst youth, is mitigated and toned down by religious education. And what I'm talking about here is there's two things. There's general religious education, which is essentially the teaching about the sociology of many religions. Then there's confessional religious education, which is religious education for adherents of those faiths. Now, one, I think, needs to be compulsory. We're terrible in this country doing general religious education. Most European countries have quite comprehensive forms of general religious education, including the UK. We really don't in this country. It's all meant to be taught somewhere in the curriculum, but it's not taught specifically. And then we have this other particular instrument that was established in the 1880s as a kind of like a pressure valve on the boiler of religion, where, and it's quite an ingenious invention, actually. The founders said, look, okay, churches, you can have your confessional religion, but you need to provide it and you need to organise it. The quality of it is up to you, and it's voluntary. Parents get to choose. So I would argue that if you've got those two elements in government schooling, general religious education, and then voluntary optional SRE, it just sits there as this pressure valve. And it means that kids aren't turning up from Islamic families, from Hindu families, from Christian families, and learning the silent curriculum. That is, we actually believe as the country, as a state, that your religion is irrelevant, that it is meaningless, that it is private, that all of its claims for any sort of public significance are irrelevant because we just don't mention it. We don't teach it, right? That's what we call the silent curriculum. Things that are taught, things that are not taught, and things that are taught but nobody admits to it. So we need to sort of civilize that because we've got a huge problem here for state education. This is an unintended consequence of pushing hard secularism in state schools. We have huge school choice. All it's going to do is push religious people into the Christian schools. And the other thing
let me hold that thought, because that's a great jump off point for when we come back. So when we come back, let's jump right into that. Right now, we want to show you a 1-minute trailer for Faith Runs Deep. For that, anybody who doesn't know about Faith Runs Deep, it's a new series that Olive Tree Media released last year, and it's looking at Christian faith in Australia. And we want you to know, especially those of you in the teaching profession, that we're working with a number of people in both material for curriculum and also religious studies curriculum for Christian schools. So here is a trailer giving you a look at Faith Runs Deep. Stories matter. Stories are important. They tell us where we've come from. They remind us about what is valuable. They help clarify our future.
I thought, I don't care what it costs me, I'm going to see what these guys have got that I haven't got.
It was as if I saw for the first time, this is what Jesus is like.
I went to church with my new friend Lisa and I heard the gospel. I heard about Jesus.
In Faith Runs Deep, we will discover stories of faith from history and today, of people with deep personal faith who have profoundly shaped this nation.
Australia lives off Christian capital to this day.
One day I heard this thump and there was a tree and it just fell over. It had rotted out right underneath. That's something that I don't think we want to see happen to our culture, because the deep roots of Christianity, they're really critical for the health of the nation.
Join us on this journey as we discover where faith runs deep in Australia. I was telling you about the Gospel of Luke. Faith Runs Deep version has the stories from the series, and this is specifically available for schools, camping ministries, groups who want to use the series, and then give Luke's Gospel to people who are looking at the series. Fabulous material. We're looking forward to seeing that all around the place. It's just so good to have so many people here letting us know you're here from all over the place, and Wagga Wagga even, which is great. And we're here with David Hastie. And before we went to the video and then my silent movie moment, before we went to that, we were talking, David, about the unintended consequence of setting up a hyper-secular kind of public school environment, which seemed to have the opposite effect of drawing everybody in, but in fact seems to be pushing people towards the Christian sector. So what are we seeing there? Is that just economics, or is there something about people looking for that sort of faith?
Look, that's a really good question. And I need to foreground this by saying I'm a strong believer in a strong state education system. And I have worked in non-government schools, and I'm a Christian and advocate for faith in schools, but Australia needs to have a strong state education system at the core of its social contract, particularly for families who are not religious and who don't want to send their children to a religious school, and also in terms of ensuring quality and equity in our society. So I will defend the state education system. Don't hear me criticising the state education system, but what I'm saying is that those who are advocating for a hyper-secular version of state education need to be cognizant, need to be aware that the reason that the low-fee Christian schooling system in the 80s was set up was a deep fear that was the trend in state education. And a decade or so later, a re-emergence of the low-fee Anglican and Presbyterian schools that emerged in the late 90s, early noughties, and also the strengthening of the Catholic systems throughout Australia.
Let me just interrupt there. Just give us a quick summary. I think everybody knows what you mean, but give us a summary of the word hyper-secular. What do you mean by that? And how does that influence public education?
Well, hyper-secular, big secular, I like to call it. It's the idea that religion has no space in the public sphere. It starts from a position, a concept of plural society that you might really see running up through the Rousseauian traditions, the Tom Paine traditions, that led into that particular branch of the French Revolution and then the American Revolution. Well, actually, the American Revolution first, then the French Revolution. But the American Revolution obviously had this deep underpinning of Presbyterianism as well. So, which is why they're always at loggerheads over in America about whether we're a religious nation or a secular nation.
Yep.
It's this idea that confessional religion is a problem. At best, at worst, it's some sort of medieval archaism that a progressive society no longer has any need for. And so why would you even bother having it in the public sphere? It's an idealistic position, it's a defensible position, but it's an unrealistic one because humans trend towards being religious. They always have. They are now and they always will. That's just a historical trend. We're not going to reverse that. And so in a plural democracy, the question is, how do you manage that? How do I defend the right of an atheist secularist person to have their views adequately represented in the schooling system as I defend the right of a Muslim person or a Hindu person, a Christian person? We need to have a social contract that allows for those things. The problem in Australia is that the amount of choice that is out there for parents is that they can shift their enrolment in a day. They can pick their student up from state education high here, move them across to Anglican school there in a day. And in Australia, we have what's called the partial voucher system, where part of the funding, not all of it, on a proportional scale, sliding socioeconomic scale, follows the student, doesn't follow the school. So what that means is you then get a reduction of funding to that state school. It partially follows the student into that non-government school. The Commonwealth has to pay less for that student. So it's an incentive for them to not push back on that. And we get this phenomena where to be research driven here, you need to look at the school choice reasons that people are expressing for why they're moving, and just before we go there, Dave, I want to go back to that, but also just for anybody that's watching, I'm sure that everybody watching this is aware of the Christian school sector, but I spoke at a conference last year, and they had a photo of when the school started 40 years ago, and there was two teachers and 18 students, and I spoke at a staff conference, just the staff conference of 600 with 4,500 students across these schools. And David, that story is repeated over and over and over again. And it's not just, and this is what I want to get to, what you're about to say, it's not just Christian families wanting their children protected in a Christian school. There's quite a number of different reasons. So you're just about to say, what are the reasons that parents are moving and taking up the option for a non-government school? Yeah, it's a complex social phenomenon, and it's unique to Australia. The choice reasons from the 6 most recent reliable studies, number one is academic performance. The second is the quality of teachers or perceived quality of teachers. Right? This is parent choice. I'm not saying anything about the quality of teachers in either sector. The third one is values. Now, that's including but not exclusively religious values. So it's a vague idea. It's a quite an inarticulate idea, but it's the third highest choice reason. Fourth is discipline and orderliness, or perceptions of. The next is facilities, quality of facilities. The next is affordability, and then student well-being. Now, I actually thought student well-being would be higher up the list, but it's not. Values is coming in at the third sort of level. And so if you look at conservative, if you like, conservative, maybe not conservative, maybe traditional families, lots of large migrant groups coming from places such as India, China, etc., the Philippines, Africa, have strong networks, family networks as a part of their culture, collectivist cultures often connected to business activities, their family businesses. They are drawn to a conservative kind of values environment. And so the latest stats I've been able to pull together is, and this is not necessarily something that the Christian schooling sector would publicise, but I'm going to do it. In the denominational schools, low-fee denominational schools, there's probably about a 30 to 35% family involvement who are actually practicing Christians. When you go to the low-fee low-fee Christian affiliated schools, it's more like 40 to 45%, more like 40 actually, if I'm going to be conservative. And so you actually have a majority. And in Catholic schools, they have a high proportion of people who would identify as Catholics, but a very large proportion of people who are actually not attending Mass, who are not involved in a parish. And so you have this huge presence in the religious schooling sector of people who are not practicing Christians, or people who are identifying as with a particular denomination, but they're not actually participating in that denomination in any measurable way. And so it's speaking into some sort of particular need in the values area. But we shouldn't just say it's about religion, about values, because it's actually about those 7 other things as well.
Yes. But the key in that, though, David, in a situation where if somebody had a hyper-secular mindset about education and about the community and about government and policy, and said that clearly Australia is a secular nation, these people may not be these families are not sending their children to these schools for a religious education, but that doesn't stop them. Well, so what does that say about their view on the faith that's being taught? It says that they're positive, neutral at worst, almost.
Well, I actually think we need to get to this again is probably not a popular opinion among some Christian school circles, but I argue that at the core of private school choice in this country is a transaction. It's actually, it lies at its base as an economic transaction, because fees, school fees, money's changing hands. That's an economic transaction. But there's also a range of transactions around school choice that you can track as economic transactions. So you might go to behavioural economics to track them as tacit or irrational choices. The fact is that, in my argument, if schools are able to deliver on most of those other choice reasons, then non-religious parents will give concession for the religious part to go on, and they won't mind because the other elements are being delivered. And so that's what I call the Christian school guarantee. And I say that to Christian schools. I say, look, if you want to ensure that your enrollments still keep coming in, make sure you've got really good academic standards, great quality of teacher, really good orderliness, really good facilities, really good student well-being, and that your values are not alienating. They're not things that drive people out of the school. They're things that embrace. And then parents will be all sorts of parents. Now, I mean, one of the big ironies is that unless you live in a high social capital area like Met North or Met East in Sydney or whatever, a lot of hyper-secularists who are advocating for secular schooling actually send their own children to non-government schools. Now, that's a general comment, right? I'm speaking out of my experience there as an educator in these schools. When I was educating Western Sydney, Dr. John Collier, who's now the acting principal at Shaw, he used to stand up and say, our highest employment category for parents, this is a non-government Christian affiliated school, is the Department of Education. That a lot of the state school parents were sending their kids, and fair enough, they can send their kids wherever they want, okay? It's one thing to have a view about the nature of society, but it's a whole other thing to expect families to use their children in some sort of social experiment for the good of society. So I really push back upon the judgment of people in high social capital postcodes against the school choicing of those who are not in those postcodes.
David, let's just say that, you know, somebody got in government, hyper-secularist, using your term again, decided that not only is Christian education in public schools a bad thing, but the non-government sector shouldn't exist. And this isn't going to happen, but let's just say it did. And they look to close down the non-government sector, and the 90% of which is Christian schools. What would happen to our education system across the country?
Well, just to say, there are a few people who are elected to the various parliaments who do believe these things.
Okay.
I don't think they'll ever govern, but just be aware of that. Well, again, it's a case of follow the numbers. The federal budget, all state budgets would collapse unless there was a forcible, violent acquisition of resources by the state. Because you've got to remember that parents and churches and foundations have paid for the majority of the facilities in these schools, and particularly schools with some antiquity, like 50, 100, 150 years. This has been, these assets have been accrued over many generations. So the only way that the state could take over those assets and not experience economic collapse would be to seize the assets. And so we're talking about a very different society to the one that we currently live in, and probably not one that any Australian government would want to promulgate. But if you just look at the figures, the Department of Planning New South Wales 3 years ago released its future projections. By 2030, 104,000 new enrolments are slated to come from non-government schools in Australia, in New South Wales alone. And so if they suddenly turn around and say, actually, no, we're going to build those schools and we're going to pay for those enrolments, we're talking a school resources index per student of around about, I think it's about $18,500 per student now. So do the maths, 104,000 times 18,500. Then you have to build the new schools. Every greenfield site school that's built by state government costs about $90 to $100 million before there is an enrolment. It costs about $15 to $20 million to the governments for a non-government school to set up a greenfield site, and often that greenfield site will be set up prior to any government funding anyway. And so if you just follow the money, the horse is bolted. Right, we cannot get that horse back in the stable unless we want to do radical restructuring, seizing assets, nationalising institutions. We have to move forward with some kind of shared narrative in our national story, our social contract about how non-government and government schools coexist.
Now, people might be able to jump on and see if there are any questions. Has there been much change? Well, now, there's a question here about what about religion in universities? Has there been much change in this sphere over the last couple of directions? So we've been focusing more on schools. What about the whole university sector, David?
Well, Australia is reasonably unique in that the university sector is very oriented towards state-run. And again, there was a transaction between the churches and the universities, the University of Sydney specifically. It was the only university really back in the day, where the churches, the university itself was set up by some leading religious figures at the time. The push for the universities came from the religious figures. But they said our trade-off is we will have the 4 colleges attached to the University of Sydney, the religious colleges, residential colleges where the religious influence was able to be over students. That's where you do the religion, and then the university is non-sectarian. And that model, and state-funded, right? That model has replicated itself into the modern university in Australia. The college system has more or less fallen away. So there's no longer that really, there's no longer a residential concept for Australian universities. I would say that there is an increasing issue around religious tolerance in universities, but that's international. That's happening everywhere. And it's not just about religion. It's about all sorts of perspectives. And I actually think the civilization it will self-correct on that. I mean, you can't just have what's been going on around intolerance of the controversy of difference, if you like, in universities is not sustainable. It's going to kill off good thinking and innovation and the invention of new good stuff. So the civilization will self-correct on that one, I think.
Look, and boy, that's a huge topic. Joe wanted to ask, what about non-government schools? Can they realistically keep denominational titles if the school no longer teach what the religion believes?
Well, that's a good question, and it's one that is vexing school councils and school boards. And so I would say right around the religious schooling movements, there's a pushback from bishops' councils, school boards, to ensure that the religious mission of the school is central. And that's been happening in a lot of the older denominational schools, where they've said, look, we've kind of drifted a fair way from this, and we want to just get back on track. And that includes introducing special programs or looking at the proportion of practicing Christians who are employed as staff and so on. So, I mean, a denominational school can call itself whatever it likes, particularly if it's sitting on, a lot of property and everyone wants to go to their school. And obviously in the denominations, there's quite a difference around what it means to be a Christian, and there's some variation there. But I would say it's important that those denominations are true to what that identity is. Otherwise, they just become state schools with crosses on top.
Yeah, and it's what you said before about, you would defend the right of a Muslim school to have Muslim teachers, as it were. And it's there's a couple of controversies in just recently where a principal is being selected for a particular denominational school, and he's been asked to sign a set of beliefs of the denomination of the school, and there's sort of outrage from the parents. And you kind of go, that's sort of a bit odd, isn't it, David? I mean, surely the principal, it's not like the student or all of the families. This is the key leadership position.
Yes and no. Look, there's we're in an interesting tension, right? Because a number of those parents are just representing society at large. And so how does the school manage, if the school has an open enrollment policy, how does the school manage the variation of viewpoints in its parent body when it comes to things like signing a contract about doctrine or particular positions? And so it's this really curious role that the Christian schools now playing in Australian society. It's kind of like a marketplace in front of the church, where everyone's welcome to come and eat off the table. Right? Everyone's welcome. And please go into the church if you find that what we are commending is pleasing, is what you want. But we can't say you're not welcome to come to the public square. And so the school has become this de facto brokering place between church and society. And there's no rule book. No one's planned this. Like there's no principals are working it out as they go along, as are school organisations. And so that particular tension, I'm aware of the thing you're discussing, mentioning. I don't want to go into the particular details of that. But it is just one of the ongoing tensions. It's the same with any school, and most Christian schools would have students from same-sex families in them. Every single Christian school I've taught in, right, since the 1990s, has had students with same-sex families, and it's been managed, right? This been managed on the ground. And that's what school principals in particular are really good at. They're real pragmatists. They manage things on the ground. Most of the people who would have a difference of opinion, a stark difference of opinion with the Christian church, will tend not to go to the media about it because they believe in the school. They want to defend the school, and going public about something is going to damage the school. And so they tend to work internally. That's been my experience.
What about one of the reasons, just jumping on, one of the reasons that you said that Christian schooling has grown is obviously the economic conditions. If the economic conditions with high interest rates and cost of living increases, do you think there'll be a drift back just economically?
Interesting. We all, when COVID hit, everyone redid their budgets. Everyone said there's going to be a COVID disaster, right? And no one's going to be able to afford anything. The exact opposite happened. But there was what we called in non-government schooling the GFC slump. And there was a slump for about 2 years where enrollments declined. I don't remember the exact percentage across the schooling sectors, but there was a slight decline in enrollments. And that we were then still carrying that decline in enrollments financially into the mid 2010s. So economic factors are there, but we've got to remember, look, Australia has the highest GDP in the world, unless you compare it to Norway. So we've got the highest median rate of millionaires in the world. So I mean, I don't want to at all disrespect the pockets of disadvantage that exist. And I don't want to disrespect the pressures of interest rates and cost of living at all.
Yep.
But I think probably, if it bleeds, it leads. I think there's a lot of noise in the media about all this tsunami of trouble coming our way. If it does, non-government school enrolments won't be the first thing that people will cut, because it's so central to their children's lives, right? And non-government schools also will seek to keep an enrolment because they see that they're a part of the family. And so
that's great. There's a couple of others, David. If I'm sorry about cutting you off. General religious education in the school system. This is coming from Herbert. How do we address the lack of general religious education in schools? I mean, is it about more volunteers? Just a quick thought on that.
No, it needs to be in the curriculum. It needs to be taught by specialists. Needs to be in the curriculum. And there's some significant and really positive moves coming from an interfaith organisation. I think it's Better Futures Together. That's actually being run by one of my PhD students, Murray Norman, or led by. And they're seeking to really push the double case of retain SRE and introduce GRE into Australian curriculum. And it's the sociology of religion, which is the sociology of humanity. If you want to understand humans, you've got to understand why they're religious, how they're religious, the differences in the history. It's like trying to teach the history of humanity, without teaching the history of sport. It's just part of who we are.
Yeah, totally. And there's this notion that that not doing it is actually a huge blind spot, because that's what you discovered when you looked at what they'd done to the history curriculum of Australia.
Well, yes, the lack of, well, that was about the teaching of the history of Christianity, the history of Christianity in our country. So teaching about the history of Christianity in our country wouldn't have been the same as teaching a general religious education. But yes, there was in the draft curriculum, version 8, that was brought out for review in mid-2021. There was a notable lack of reference to the role of Christianity, not just in the history of Australia, but the history of society. But having said that, there was a lack of a whole bunch of other histories as well that I was a part of talking about. Now, I came to the conclusion that there was nothing conspiratorial about this at all. There was no big plot. It was just that the committee structures that were built around the review and drafting process mostly came from state schools and state education. And so obviously thinking about religion, Christian history, it's just not on their agenda, right? It's not part of what they're thinking about. And a lot of that energy has been siphoned off into the Catholic and non-government independent school systems. And so had they had a broader representation that was proportional to the enrolment population in schools, then I don't think they would have arrived at the point in that draft where people would have started making noise about it. But having said that, the drafting process did what it was meant to do. They released the draft, people complained about it, it was rectified. And my view is that the final version of the Australian curriculum is really quite strong in places on the role of Christianity, particularly in the year 7 to 10 civics curriculum. I think it's a little weak in the year 7 in the K to 6 civics curriculum, but certainly there's been a much stronger inclusion, as there should be, not for religious reasons. It's just simply historically accurate.
Totally. David, look, you have been fantastic. Thank you for everybody for putting your questions up. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all your questions. Apologies for the sound issues earlier, but we've got there. David, that's been fantastic. A round of applause from everybody. Really appreciate your material. Thank you for being on this webinar with us. And for everybody on the webinar, let me just wrap up by saying a couple of things. One, just let people know that it's available. It's free. It's online. Why don't you also subscribe to the Olive Tree Media YouTube channel? And if you subscribe to to the YouTube channel, you'll be able to clearly watch this webinar and all the other material we've had. We've had several webinars, a couple of webinars this year and last year. They're all available there. So make sure you subscribe to the Olive Tree Media YouTube channel. And also, finally, just to remind you what Ainsley said earlier, that our next webinar is on the 6th of September. This time it's in the evening, 7 p.m. That's because, as Ainsley mentioned, we're talking to Justin Briley. Justin Briley lives just outside of London. He ran the Unbelievable radio show with Premier Radio for many years, and he's releasing a book which is called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. Now, I actually met with Justin in London in February this year, and he gave me a PDF of his book. So I've read the book. It's an outstanding read, and it's a really interesting reflection on what's happening. You know, the whole notion that, you know, faith is dying, religion's dying, et cetera, et cetera. Well, there's a real shift even in Western nations at the moment, and it's a bit under the radar. And Justin writes about this and reflects on it in his book, and he's going to talk to us on the webinar. So make sure you join us for the webinar. Hey, thanks for being with us. Thanks for all the people from all over the country that have been with us. I know many of you will be watching this on a replay. Thanks for joining us on the replay. We trust you have a fabulous day, and we look forward to seeing you, if not before, on the 6th of September. Thanks. Stories matter. Stories are important. They tell us where we've come from. They remind us about what is valuable. They help clarify our future.
I thought, I don't care what it costs me, I'm going to see what these guys have got that I haven't got.
It was as if I saw for the first time, this is what Jesus is like.
I went to church with my new friend Lisa and I heard the gospel. I heard about Jesus.
In Faith Runs Deep, we will discover stories of faith from history and today, of people with deep personal faith who have profoundly shaped this nation.
Australia lives off Christian capital to this day.
It is woven into the very fabric of who we are as a country.
I believe when it comes to faith in this nation, that we're not dealing with a group of people who hate Christianity or hate God. We're actually dealing with people who don't understand Christianity, who don't understand who Jesus is and what he's done.
One day I heard this thump, and there was a tree just by the back fence there, and it just fell over. It had rotted out right underneath. That's something that I don't think we want to see happen to our culture, because the deep roots of Christianity, they're really critical for the health of the nation.
Join us on this journey as we discover where faith runs deep in Australia.